The foreman at Thornhill Mill noticed it first. Every morning at 5:30, when the tower bell rang to summon the day's shift, he'd check his pocket watch, a habit from years of keeping order among 200 souls and as many looms. And every morning for 3 years running, his watch matched the tower, to the second. This was 1847. Clocks didn't do that. A good timepiece might lose a minute or two per week. Church towers drifted. Station clocks required constant adjustment. Even the finest marine chronometers, those precious instruments that kept ships from running aground, needed weekly correction. Time was slippery then, something you chased, never quite caught. But the Thornhill Tower never slipped. Picture the scene. November dawn, still dark at 6. Fog rolling thick through the Pennine valleys, swallowing the mills one by one until only their chimneys poke through like drowning men. The air tastes of coal smoke and wet stone. Workers stream through the gates, hands shoved deep in pockets, breath clouding. Then the bell, not a ragged clang but a voice, clear, certain, perfectly placed in time. You could close your eyes and count the seconds between strikes. 1, 2, 3, never 3 and a bit, never 2 and most of 3. 6 o'clock, exactly. The textile workers began to rely on it in ways they'd never relied on the old tower. They'd time their walks from home, leave at 5:15, arrive at the gates as the bell tolled 6. Mothers nursing babies could judge the precise moment to bundle their children and run. The mill operated on split-second coordination, now shuttles flying, steam pistons hammering, hundreds of hands moving in concert, and the tower conducted it all like some vast mechanical orchestra. But here's what unsettled them. The tower never needed winding adjustments. The clockmaker never climbed up with his tools to nudge the mechanism forward or back. Other towers in other towns. The clockmen were up there every week, sometimes twice, compensating for temperature swings, oil viscosity, worn gears. The Thornhill Tower just ran. 3 years became 4. 4 became 5. The perfection started to feel unnatural. Workers would stand in the yard during breaks, staring up at the stone tower, watching the minute hand creep with mechanical certainty. Some said they could hear it ticking from 40 feet below, even over the roar of the looms. A deep, patient rhythm. Tick, 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 like a heartbeat that never missed. The tower had become more than a tool. It was a presence. His name was Samuel Ferrers, and nobody knew quite what to make of him. He wasn't guild-trained, wasn't from one of the established clockmaking families in London or Lancashire. He'd learned his craft working on steam engines, first as a millwright's apprentice, then as a freelance mechanic fixing broken governors and valve systems. Somewhere in those years of crawling through engine houses, watching brass gears spin and pistons slam, he taught himself horology. The mill owner's ledgers show he was hired in 1844 for £30 to build a tower clock of good quality. £30. That's what you'd pay for a decent but unremarkable mechanism, the kind that would drift like any other. Ferrers was 43 years old, unmarried, lived in 2 rooms above a grocer's shop. The few people who remembered him later described a man who spoke little, ate his meals alone, and spent his evenings sketching mechanical diagrams by candlelight. He had a habit of staring at moving things, water wheels, spinning jennies, even cart wheels in the street, with an intensity that made people uncomfortable. He'd written to watchmakers in Geneva, to instrument makers in Paris, to anyone whose work showed even a hint of innovation beyond tradition. Most never replied. A few sent back polite dismissals. But Ferrers kept writing, kept asking questions, kept absorbing every scrap of knowledge about precision timekeeping he could find. What he was really doing was something most craftsmen never attempted. He was trying to solve the fundamental problem of mechanical time. See, every clock fights a war against physics. Temperature makes metal expand and contract, changing the length of pendulums and the tension in springs. Friction wears away at pivot points. Oil thickens in winter, thins in summer. Gravity pulls differently at different latitudes. The very air presses down with varying weight as barometric pressure shifts. The great clockmakers of the era, Men like John Harrison, Abraham Louis Breguet, had spent lifetimes finding clever workarounds. Bimetallic pendulums that compensated for temperature, jeweled bearings to reduce friction, complex escapements that divided each tick into finer and finer increments. But these were expensive solutions, requiring rare materials and extraordinary skill. They belonged in royal observatories and naval academies, not in a textile mill in Yorkshire. Furrers, working alone in that tower through the winter of 1844, decided to reinvent everything. He'd brought his own tools, his own materials. The mill owner barely saw him for 5 months. Occasionally, someone would spot lamplight in the tower windows at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. Once, a night watchman claimed he heard Furrers talking to himself up there, working through calculations aloud, his voice echoing down the stone stairwell. When he finally descended and declared the clock ready, he left town within a week, took a position at an ironworks in Sheffield, didn't attend the dedication ceremony, didn't ask for a testimonial or reference, just moved on. The mill owner thought it strange, but not remarkable. Itinerant mechanics were common enough. The man had done his job and left. The clock worked. He had no idea what Furrers had actually built. Imagine climbing those tower stairs now, your hand trailing up the cold stone wall, daylight fading as you ascend. At the top, a heavy wooden door. Push it open and you're in the clock chamber, a room barely 12 feet square, thick with the smell of oil and brass and old wood. And there in the center hangs the mechanism. At first glance it looks wrong. The proportions aren't quite what you'd expect. The pendulum is shorter than standard but oddly massive at the bob. The gear train sits at an unusual angle. There are rods running through the frame that seem to serve no obvious purpose. But watch it run. Watch closely. The escapement, the heart of any clock, the device that converts the pendulum's swing into the measured turning of gears, operates with an eerie smoothness. In most clocks, the escapement creates a distinct tick-tock as it catches and releases. This one barely whispers. It's a sound like a breath drawn and slowly released. The pallets engage the escape wheel with such precision that there's almost no impact, no jar, no wasted energy. Furrers had designed what modern horologists would call a gravity escapement decades before the concept became widespread. Instead of the pendulum pushing directly against the gear train, which creates friction and resistance, he'd arranged a system where gravity did most of the work. The pendulum served only to trigger a release at the perfect moment. It was brilliant. It was absurdly ahead of its time. But that was just the beginning. Those mysterious rods running through the frame, temperature compensation. Furrers had created a system of steel and brass rods arranged so that when heat expanded one metal, it contracted against another, keeping the effective length of the pendulum constant. Not the bimetallic strips you'd see in expensive chronometers, something cruder but equally effective, fashioned from materials he could source locally. The gears themselves were cut at ratios that seemed wrong until you understood what he was doing. Most clockmakers used standard divisions, 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour. Simple, traditional, sensible. Furrers had calculated that by using slightly different ratios and distributing the load across more gear teeth, he could reduce the wear on any single pivot point. The mechanism would age more slowly, maintain its accuracy longer. And the materials. God, the materials. Where did a freelance mechanic in 1844 get access to steel alloys that wouldn't be commercially available for another 20 years? Did he smelt them himself? The pendulum bob was filled with mercury, expensive, dangerous, but perfect for maintaining consistent mass. The bearings were made from something that wasn't quite brass and wasn't quite bronze, some experimental mix that reduced friction to almost nothing. He'd even designed the anchor points, the places where the mechanism attached to the tower structure to isolate vibration. The whole clock floated, in a sense, cushioned from the shudders and tremors of the building around it. Every detail showed the same pattern. Furrers had looked at accepted practice and asked, but what if we didn't do it that way? And then he'd found answers that wouldn't become standard for decades. The truly maddening thing, he left no plans, no journal, no sketches of his thinking, just the clock itself, ticking away in its stone room, a three-dimensional treatise on precision engineering that nobody knew how to read. The stories started small. A weaver swore the tower clock ticked louder when her grandmother died. She'd been working the night shift and heard it, the rhythm suddenly audible over the looms, insistent, like it was counting down something important. Another worker claimed the clock showed the wrong time once, just once, on the morning his son was born. 6:20 instead of 6 exactly. He'd checked his pocket watch, checked the station clock down the road. They said 6. The tower said 20 past. An hour later, when he checked again, the tower was back in perfect sync with everything else, as if it had briefly jumped forward to mark some personal moment, then returned to its duty. The superintendent dismissed these as superstition, nonsense born from too many hours in the mill dust, but the stories multiplied. Some said the clock struck 13 on stormy nights. Others claimed you could hear it ticking in your sleep if you lived within sight of the tower, a presence in your dreams, measuring out your life in perfect increments. The older workers remembered the previous clock, an ordinary mechanism that had served adequately for 30 years. Nobody had told stories about that one. Nobody had ascribed it with intention or awareness. But this clock felt different. It became a tradition for new workers to climb the tower stairs on their first day, to stand in the mechanism room and listen. Some felt comforted by the perfect rhythm, like standing beside the breathing of some vast, benevolent animal. Others felt watched, judged even, as if the clock was taking their measure, deciding whether they belonged in its presence. The town priest gave a sermon about it once in 1851. He never mentioned the tower by name, but everyone knew. He spoke about mankind's hubris in creating machines too perfect, too precise, about how precision in earthly matters might offend the divine order, where only God's time was absolute. The mill owner was in the congregation. He did not look pleased. But privately, even the skeptics felt it. The clock's perfection had weight. When every other timepiece in your life requires adjustment, requires human intervention, requires forgiveness for its imperfection, and then you encounter something that never fails, it unsettles something deep. The town began organizing their lives not just by the clock, but around it. The annual Whitsun Fair synchronized its events to the tower chimes. Weddings were scheduled for exact hours, 4 o'clock, not around 4. Even funerals departed at precise minutes. The whole community was slowly becoming synchronized, their lives clicking into place like gears in that mechanism up in the tower. And through it all, the clock ran. Through the hot summer of 1852, when the mill almost burned. Through the bitter winter of 1854, when ice coated every surface. Through the decades, as gas lamps became electric lights, as horses gave way to motor cars, as the world transformed around that stone tower. It kept perfect time. By 1890, the Thornhill mill was struggling. Textile production had moved elsewhere. The building changed hands, became a warehouse, then a manufacturing concern making bicycle parts. The clock continued. By 1920, the tower was all that remained of the original mill complex. Everything else had been demolished or rebuilt, but the clock continued. Nobody quite wanted to admit they were maintaining something they didn't understand. Each generation of clockkeepers learned the winding procedure, learned where to oil, but nobody touched the core mechanism. It had taken on the quality of a relic. You didn't tinker with it. You just kept it going. In 1947, exactly 100 years after Ferrers finished his work, the tower was declared structurally unsound. The stone was crumbling. The building it had once belonged to was long gone. The tower stood alone in a lot scheduled for redevelopment. The local historical society made inquiries. Could the clock be saved? Could it be moved? That's when the horologists arrived. The man who led the examination was named Thomas Weatherby. He'd spent 30 years restoring antique timepieces, had worked on church towers across England, knew the history of British clockmaking backwards and forwards. He climbed those stairs expecting a competent mid-Victorian mechanism, probably Harrison-influenced. Maybe some nice touches, but nothing extraordinary. He stood in that chamber for 20 minutes before he trusted himself to speak. The clock was still running, still keeping perfect time after a full century. Weatherby's hands shook as he examined the escapement. He traced the temperature compensation system with his fingertips, disbelieving. He measured gear ratios, calculated load distributions, tested the alloy composition of the bearings. Nothing made sense. "This is wrong," he kept saying. "This shouldn't exist. Not in 1847, not in 1947. This is wrong." But it wasn't wrong. It was decades.